Storm 1 is the player's avatar in EDF5 and EDF6. Starting off as a normal soldier, Storm 1 makes a name for themselves by surviving through any battlefield no matter how hopeless they may seem and defeating countless numbers of primers single-handedly. Members of the EDF refer to them as the hero of EDF, and even the primers recognizes them as a threat. In this video, let's look at how Storm 1 became the hope that saved humanity from extinction. Storm 1 is not an ordinary civilian even from the very beginning of EDF5. For example, Storm 1 has the ability to use every weapon and vehicle. The most outstanding weapon that Storm 1 can use are the combat frames. It is noted even from Mission 2 that a license is required to pilot a combat frame and that the sergeant was the only one who had a license. Since the combat frame is a military vehicle with immense power, there is no possibility that a civilian can have a license to pilot one. However, Storm 1 can pilot a combat frame from the very beginning regardless of the class. The fact that even the two classes that don't specialize in vehicles, Wing Diver and Fencer, can pilot the combat frames implies that Storm 1 has experience piloting a combat frame somewhere in the past. An even more direct example of Storm 1's extraordinariness is the aerator's radio comms as a civilian. In many of the voice lines, the operators receiving the signal show obvious signs of confusion as they deploy the aerial attacks ordered by the aerator. In addition, the operator of the Spritefall mentions that the Spritefall was sealed by the General Headquarters, which deepens the mystery even more as to why the aerator had access to this channel. Of course, it is easy to dismiss all of these points as video game logic, since all of these points are vital to making the gameplay more enjoyable. But when the developers decide to incorporate these points into the story, they become anything but that. Now, let's move on to the main topic. Why is Storm 1 so strong? The simple answer to this question is experience and luck. If you know anything about the EDF6 storyline, then you should know that a key part in the story is time travel. By destroying the cross on the ring-shaped ship on a certain day, the Professor and Storm 1 can go back in time while retaining their memories. Throughout the game, they go back in time 4 times in order to find a way for humanity to survive. However, there are hints that imply that the first time we travel in EDF6 is not actually the first time for the Professor and Storm 1. In Mission 13, the day of, the Professor already knows the existence of the cross and tells Storm 1 that they are professionals at this mission and that Storm 1 should already be used to it. While the other members of the team try to stop Storm 1 from approaching the ring, the Professor tells Storm 1 to ignore them since they do not know the existence of the cross underneath the ring. From this, we can tell that the Professor and Storm 1 have already destroyed the cross and time traveled multiple times even before the events of EDF5. What then is the exact number of times they time traveled? In Mission 22, the third machine, when the Professor contacts Storm 1 over the radio, he mentions that it took 6 tries to finally get in contact. This implies that the ongoing timeline is the 6th timeline. The numbering of the titles that appear every time we destroy the cross and the number of crosses on the missions titled Base 251 and the day of match this number since the title that was shown when we first time traveled was EDF6 and the number of crosses on Base 251 and the day of for this timeline is 6. Through this, we now know that Storm 1 has time traveled 4 times before the events of EDF5 and that the beginning of EDF5 is right after they travel back from the 4th timeline. Now that we know the number of times Storm 1 has time traveled, let's figure out how long each timeline is. According to the main website, the beginning of EDF5 takes place in 2022 when the primers begin their attack. After the attack on Base 228, Storm 1 spends about 5 months in training before becoming an official EDF soldier. The fight against the primers ends in 2024, 2 years after the first attack when Storm 1 defeats the Nameless. The beginning of EDF6 takes place in 2027, 3 years after the end of EDF5, and is mentioned in the dialogue with the Professor that Storm 1 was still fighting in the front lines during these 3 years. How long the time between Storm 1's arrival at Base 251 and the destruction of the cross is unknown, but we can estimate it to be around 1 or 2 months at most. In total, one loop is around 5 years plus or minus a couple of months. Although where we go back to in the time leap do differ between each timeline, let's keep things simple by saying each timeline is around 5 years. Since Storm 1 has gone through 4 timelines before EDF5, we can tell that Storm 1 has approximately 20 years of combat experience against the primers by the start of EDF5. This explains the reason why Storm 1 is so competent from the beginning of EDF5. Since humanity most likely did not have the upper hand during these timelines, Storm 1 learned to use whatever weapons they had at hand, including many vehicles and the combat frames, as well as the codes to all the airstrikes. As the game goes on, the amount of experience Storm 1 has only adds on. During the EDF5 timeline, Storm 1 fights for 5 years. Since the EDF6 and EDF7 timeline starts after the 5-month training period, they add up to a total of around 9 years. The EDF8 and EDF9 timelines both start with Storm 1 as a civilian, so they add up to a total of about 10 years. This means that by the time we defeat the primers once and for all, Storm 1 has been fighting against the primers for a total of 44 years. Through these years of combat, Storm 1 has become a professional at fighting the primers. EDF headquarters recognize Storm 1's combat capabilities, which is best shown through the dialogue in Mission 135 Alien Attack Dash. The Major and the Operator show their disbelief in Storm 1's ability to fight the primers, even going as far as to say that Storm 1's existence is proof that the time machine exists. Although Storm 1's experience is what allows them to be the unstoppable force they are in EDF5 and EDF6, it is their luck that most likely kept them alive during the earlier timelines. There are not many voice lines that directly refer to Storm 1's luck, but there is one voice line from Mission 129 intersecting gunfire that does. In this voice line, an EDF soldier mentions that Storm 1 is very lucky and that he was not able to win even once in a game of cards. Since it is not very likely that Storm 1 memorized all the cards in the past timelines, this occurrence is most likely a direct result of Storm 1's luck. Another factor that may have played a large role in not just Storm 1's rise, but EDF's victory over the primers is the existence of the Captain. The Captain exists in every single timeline that we know of, and in every timeline he orders the attack on the ring the exact day the time leap occurs. From this, we can speculate that he was the one who ordered the attack on the ring in the very first timeline. During this attack, Storm 1 and the Professor accidentally destroy the cross under the ring, resulting in the very first time leap. Although the Captain himself does not retain any of his memories, his unwavering will to fight the primers until the very end may have been what allowed humanity to attain an otherwise impossible victory. In conclusion, Storm 1 was a naturally created super soldier that was born as a result of many coincidences coming together. Because the primers refused to accept anything but a perfect victory over humanity, Storm 1 became a vessel that stored all of humanity's efforts to take out the primers. In the end, the EDF spirit of fighting until the very end was what allowed humanity to defeat a far more advanced civilization. This is going to be the end of this video. If you still have any questions about EDF lore, feel free to ask in the comments and I'll be happy to reply. If you enjoyed this video, it would be great if you could leave a like so that this video can reach more people. Thank you for watching and I'll see you guys in the next video.